Don't you wish for simpler days when numbers didn't go down all the time? Days of flowers and roses and happy sights. Well, there's been a lot of pain in the market. The Trump tariff disaster continues. Stocks continue to plummet and people continue to freak out. But something is a little different with Bitcoin. See, the stocks had a really, really bad week. The S&P had a really bad Thursday this week, and Friday was even worse. But guess what? Bitcoin's just fine, which I'm really surprised by, actually. I had genuine shock. My jaw dropped earlier today when I checked my phone for the price of the market. I checked it at 3 or 4 p.m. today, local time. And I was like, wait a second, Bitcoin's up and the S&P is down almost 6%? That's crazy. When Thursday was over and the bloodbath of the tariffs had been absorbed by the market, we were looking at 5%. I thought, okay, yeah, maybe Friday's going to be bad too, but we'll go down a couple percent. No, Friday was even worse than Thursday. I'm not excited about this. I'm not excited by seeing pain in the markets, right? I think a lot of people right now are talking about tariffs purely from a practical sense, but I think it's really important, again, to focus on the humanitarian component, right? No matter if you think the Trump tariffs are brilliant or stupid, or if they're good for the world, bad for the world, good for treasury rates, bad for treasury rates, good for Bitcoin, bad for Bitcoin, I think the first and foremost thing we have to remember, which most people forget because most people are focused on number go up or down, is the human cost, right? Obviously, these tariffs are going to be bad for the amount of goods and services circulating throughout the world, right? And the reality is that when there are less goods and services circulating throughout the world, that means that less people are going to be able to have stuff to survive. Sure, that might cause temporary discomfort for Americans, but for many, many people, millions of people around the world, people that are in less privileged positions such as you and I, that's really bad. So, I'm not necessarily excited at all. In fact, I'm pretty annoyed and upset by these tariffs. I think they're going to be bad for the economy. Maybe there will be, upsides or whatever. And, I'm not saying anything from a political sense one way or the other. I'm just saying purely from the human cost sense. I think there's a very strong possibility that economic contraction is likely because of these tariffs. And if that happens, we know that that's not bad for the world, right? Everybody was so quick to shut down the world in 2020 because of a disease. But the reality is that the quote-unquote cure of the disease, right? The economic sanctions and the economic shutdown from the disease was really, really bad, right? Sure, maybe we shrink a little bit of our economy, but here in America, when people shrink our economy, we might lose jobs, or we might, skip going to the movies or skip getting that new car. But in many places of the world, in fact, for most of the world, when the economy shrinks, that is quite frankly life and death for a lot of people. So that should be the first thing to say, is that I'm not happy by seeing the stock market fall. I'm not happy by seeing these tariffs happen. However, what I am happy about is I am happy to see Bitcoin beginning to decorrelate from these kinds of high-risk assets, right? The signal in the noise right now is that Bitcoin just did something that, in my opinion, it has never done before to this same kind of degree, okay? Literally right now at the time of recording, right, this evening and tomorrow morning, a lot of wealthy billionaires, centimillionaires, and decamillionaires are asking themselves, what the F? Why on earth is Bitcoin up? Right? Bitcoin, I've been told, is this high-risk speculative asset that just relies on the QE, right? And blah, 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 blah. As soon as there's a recession, blah, 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 Bitcoin's going to fall, blah, 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 right? Well, no, here we are. The S&P fell 5% 2 days in a row, and yet Bitcoin is up. In fact, Bitcoin is basically flat over the last few weeks, right? Bitcoin is still flirting with a price that 6 months ago it had never hit before. Right? That's a crazy, crazy thing. The S&P 500 has almost wiped out its entire gains over the last year in just the last couple weeks, right? In just the last month or so, the S&P is down. Now it's down about 18% in total. We're getting pretty close to a 20% correction zone. And if Trump's not careful, he could really ignite a lot of fear in the stock market, even more than there is now. And so my point is that I think something really interesting has happened with Bitcoin, right? In 2020, when we had all kind of macro uncertainty and stocks crashed, Bitcoin crashed even harder. Well, not only has Bitcoin not crashed even harder, not only has it not crashed the same amount, not only has it been flat, but it's basically up a little bit. Am I saying this is gonna be a long-term thing? No, obviously. Literally, we're just going on a couple of days of post-tariff news data, right? Obviously, give it a few weeks, give it a few months, give it the rest of the year, and something entirely different could unfold. However, for the time being, I think that's a really, really interesting thing. And right now, there could potentially be literally trillions, if not tens of trillions of dollars of capital right now managed by people that for the first time in their entire careers and their entire working lives are looking at Bitcoin thinking, that did not do what I expected, right? Sure, I didn't expect Trump to be as, strict as he was, or I didn't expect this or that or whatever, right? But why on earth is Bitcoin not down 20%? Why on earth is Bitcoin not down under $50,000 again, right? I think a lot of people are going to have that mindset shift. Where do I think is that mindset shift going to end? Where do I think it's inevitable it's going to go? I think what people are going to figure out is that Bitcoin is the new index. Bitcoin is more diversified. Bitcoin is more decentralized than the index fund, right? What's the whole reason? What's the whole narrative? What's the whole brand, the whole story as to why people buy the S&P 500? What's the whole story as to why they buy the QQQ at the NASDAQ? The whole story, the whole reason is because I admit I'm not smart enough to time the market. I admit I'm not smart enough to pick the winning companies. So what I'm going to do is, on a long-term time horizon, I'm going to slowly allocate to a diversified basket of different companies. And over time, as long as those companies continue to be productive and as long as we continue to print more dollars, eventually I'll be able to retire after 20, 30, 40 years of consistently contributing to those S&P funds, index funds, or mutual funds, right? But, I think a lot of people are going to go from viewing Bitcoin as a high-risk thing to realizing, wait a second, okay, everything I just said applies to Bitcoin even more so, because the stock market has 7 companies that are pulling up the losses of the other 493 companies. And wait a second, if they're not performing as well, why am I only allocated to American corporate paper? Why do I also allocate? Why not also allocate to global electric money, right? Tariffs are really bad because if you're exposed to the given political energy, the given corporate energy of one nation, when that one nation wages war, economic war with these tariffs, that hurts you. But if you have a global neutral reserve asset, Bitcoin, that isn't subject to any given one country's tariffs, taxes, or torts, all of a sudden you realize not only does Bitcoin have potentially more upside, but it has lower risk. And I've been saying for years that Bitcoin has less risk than the traditional stock market, and I understand why people have been very hesitant against the idea. Even people in Bitcoin, like, oh, Luke, well, I'm in Bitcoin, I have a lot of Bitcoin, and it's still irresponsible for you to say it has less risk than the stock market, blah, blah, blah. And I totally understand why people say that, right? That's just my opinion. But I do think it's true. If your time horizon is 1, 2, 3 years, then yeah, I can totally understand why you're saying that the stock market has less risk than Bitcoin. But my time horizon is 500 years, 300 years, 200 years, 50 years, 30 years at the minimum. And because my time horizon is so much longer, I believe that Bitcoin is lower risk. Why? Because every 25 years, the S&P 500 rotates 70% of its companies. 70% of its companies rotate every quarter of a century, right? And so I know what I'm buying when I'm buying Bitcoin. I'm buying the same consistent thing. When I buy the S&P 500, I don't really know what I'm buying. 70% of it is going to be different by the time I'm 50, right? In my own lifetime, and I'm relatively young, being 25 years old, in my own lifetime, the S&P 500 is 70% different than when I was born, right? And so why would I buy something that I don't know what it's going to be every 25 years for the next 100 years? That means 4 times over, 70% rotates. So Bitcoin's a more consistent thing to understand what I'm buying. And because it's more distributed, because it's the global index of productivity, whereas the US stock market or US index fund is a subset of corporate paper in a single country, right? I don't want to be exposed only to corporate paper. I want to be exposed to all productivity, right? I don't only be exposed to American productivity. I want to be exposed to global productivity. And I don't want to be exposed to the best companies of the day. I want to be exposed not only to the best companies of the day, but the best companies of the far future. Bitcoin is lower risk because you get a greater share of the global population, you get a greater share of the world's industries, and not only do you get all future productivity, all current productivity, but you get all future productivity as well, right? If I'm going to buy a stock in the S&P 500, let's say, within the index, the problem is that that's a company that's already IPO'd, that's a company that's already grown, that's a company that already is worth a large enough amount of money and regulated enough that it gets included into the index. But I don't want exposure to that. I want more upside. And so how do you get the upside? You have to be exposed to technologies that bring more productivity to people. And how do you get exposed to that technology? Well, you have to buy a share in it. How do you buy a share in it? Well, Bitcoin is the only way to do that. You can't buy a share of a company building technologies that don't exist yet. But with Bitcoin, you do have the possibility to buy a fraction of the future Bitcoin network. And in the future Bitcoin network, there will be technology that doesn't exist yet today, that we inherently can't price in. And so Bitcoin not only is lower risk than the S&P 500 because you get a larger share of the world's population, a larger share of the world's industries, and a larger share of time, not just 2025, but 2125, right? You get a larger share of time, of people, of kinds of energy, and ultimately, in my opinion, that lowers its risk greatly. When you are more decentralized, more distributed, you lower your risk fantastically. And also we're seeing that quite literally today with this divergence between stocks and Bitcoin. So what do I expect for the rest of the year? I expect to be surprised. I'm very surprised by the divergence today, right? Bitcoin was up, whatever, 2 to 3%, depending on, what time zone you're in. The S&P 500 fell about 6% after 5% yesterday. An amazing fall for the week entirely. And I think that's a pretty big signal, especially given Bitcoin's market cap size. Not only did Bitcoin refuse to fall like the stock market, but given Bitcoin's size, it's a big asset class now, right? Many people are aware of its existence, even if they still hate Bitcoin, right? And so I think there's something more than meets the eye here. And I think a lot of money, a lot of individuals, wealthy individuals with trillions of dollars of assets under management, for the first time in their careers are asking themselves, well, even if I hate Bitcoin, even if I think it's dumb, even if I think it's a Ponzi, even if I think whatever, maybe I should have some non-zero allocation, because at the very least, it's not correlated to S&P. Are they going to take action on that and Bitcoin's just going to rip to the moon from here? No, I don't think so, right? But it plants a seed, and that seed is going to sprout over the coming years. And probably this event right now, this week, is going to be remembered by long-term investors in the stock market, right? By everybody right now that's having their WTF moment of what on earth happened. Why did Bitcoin stay flat for this week? That was objectively the worst week in the stock market, basically in the last 5 years, right? This is going to be a memory people are going to have. And that seed is going to be able to blossom in future cycles when people start to see it actually is decoupling, right? I don't think it's decoupling permanently now, but next time, maybe it's not temporary. Next time, maybe it's permanent. And this is that first touch point for most people, I think. And so my encouragement to you is to zoom out and have a long-term time horizon. I think these tariffs are going to have a lot of chaos. Maybe you think that's good chaos. Maybe you think that's bad chaos. I don't really care what you think. I just know what I think. And what I think is that probably there'll be some good things, and I think there'll be a lot of bad things. And I think a lot of people will benefit. I think a lot of people will suffer. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all I know is that we have less in common with the future than the past, and I hope and pray that future is better. And as long as I'm acting with the intellectual consistency that I'm hoping that future is better, I want to own a share of that future. And what's the best way to own a share of that future? Is with Bitcoin, silly. It's not with American corporate paper of current companies, and only 5% of the world's population owns that index, right? That's not a global index. Oh, the S&P 500 is lower risk than Bitcoin because it's more decentralized and I'm more diversified. No, you're not. You're only diversified to a small subset of a small industry of about 5% of the world's population. I want to be exposed to Bitcoin, right? I don't want to be a pessimist that's buying the US corporate index because I believe that only a small people is going to continue to have access to it. I want to be an optimist and have the assumption, the bold, courageous assumption that maybe if we actually treated our fellow human beings with decency and respect instead of diluting them endlessly towards zero, maybe if we actually gave everybody the opportunity to have their energy, time, and value saved into the future, maybe instead of having 5% of the world having access to the current era's monetary system of savings technology, which is the S&P 500, we can instead convert them to Bitcoin. I want that future, and that's why, for me, I don't know what the next few months is going to have. I think there's going to be a lot of chaos, whether you think that's good or bad. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin inevitably will decouple from the stock market, and people will no longer view Bitcoin as a high-risk asset that's correlated to the QQQ, but they're going to view it as a much lower risk asset, even more lower risk than gold. And I think gold's rise is a signal of what's to come. I think gold is just beginning to signal at what Bitcoin is going to do. Gold is a multi-deca-trillion-dollar asset that just had one of its best years in decades, right? Bitcoin is an asset class 10 times smaller. And people are complaining that, oh, the price isn't going up enough. Okay, do you understand that gold, an asset class without the FOMO, without the hopium, and without the governments buying it, or the same exploding interest like Bitcoin, still made a multi-trillion-dollar move this year, right? Like gold, objectively on the world stage, was a bigger story this year than Bitcoin in terms of absolute number of dollars moved. You understand how much higher Bitcoin could go? It's going to millions and millions of dollars a coin, but that's not what matters. What matters is we want the whole world to own the index of the planet, and we want the whole world to demonetize goods and services so much that we no longer fight trade wars and tariff wars competing over some kind of scarcity between goods and services, right? That's the fundamental problem of what's going on. We live in this monetary fiat world where we have to monetize something, so we monetize oil, real estate, guns, and violence, and we have to tariff that, tax that, and tort that because it's what we value and it's what we control. But in the future, everything's going to be like oxygen. It's going to be so cheap, it's going to be so abundant. Why go to war over it, right? Why risk our Bitcoin over fighting over something that has no monetary premium to us, right? That's the future I'm hoping for. And so maybe there's a time and a place to be pessimistic and to think that the world's about to blow up, but in that case, you don't even want gold. You want canned food, guns, and bullets, right? So, you know, maybe have guns and bullets, but besides that, for everything else, I'm going to remain an optimist, and I'm going to remain optimistic on Bitcoin price going up and human freedom going up. And so in that case, I'll continue to own Bitcoin. And so without further ado, I'm going to go back to dinner. I am here in Texas. There's a big Bitcoin dinner up there. I'm going to go eat some barbecue, eat some yummy cookies or cake or whatever they have for dessert, drink a beer or two, crash and go to bed because I'm exhausted, and then do it all over again tomorrow, because this isn't just about getting rich. It's about changing lives. It's about making friends, and it's about hopefully building a better future for the billions and billions of people yet to be born. It's not just about the millions of people that need our help now. It's about the billions of people that are coming in the next few decades. We have less in common with the near future than the ancient past. Thanks.